Our next topic is going to address this very issue of the divide between the Jewish community in the United States, or in the diaspora Jewish community, and the Jewish community in Israel. And as Zach pointed out earlier, this is the first time in our history where we have two very strong, very powerful, and very opinionated communities. And here to address the question of whether there's a shared future between us is Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer. Now, first of all, everyone should follow this man on Facebook. His statuses are wonderful. He's got great stories. He's a terrific writer, but I'll tell you a little bit more. He's the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He's a leading thinker and an author on the meaning of Israel to American Jews and the value of the Jewish past to the Jewish present in questions of leadership and change in the American Jewish life. He is exactly who can be addressing this question for us. So please, let's welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Zach and Ronit, for putting together this incredible day. And it really is an honor to have the opportunity to kick off this conversation, which addresses so many issues that I and my institution think about all the time, the relationship between these two communities, and that exemplifies what thought leadership can look like in our communities, where instead of simply being anxious about these problems, we bring together all the people who want to participate in these conversations and make the conversations themselves happen. It's kind of what we talk about a lot in our work is that sometimes the activity can be the outcome, and I think that's a hope that we all have for today. I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity to talk about a pet peeve of mine that helps us get at the problematics of what we're trying to explore, and that is this idea that constitutes the title of this session, which is most closely held by people who are afraid that the idea is disappearing, which is that the Jewish people are some sort of family. Zach, you referred to it in your opening, as you did, Sarah, as well. The truth is, I'm not sure that the Jewish people as a family has ever been true. And right now, even for those of us who are concerned that the relationship between Israel and world Jewry is tense and pulling apart, I'm not sure that insisting on that story, that metaphor, that narrative of the Jewish people as family is even helping us anymore. Now, we all know that something has shifted considerably over the last couple of generations and continues to shift between these two communities. Some sociologists talk about this as what they call the distancing phenomenon, that the next generation of Jews are distancing themselves from Israel. Other sociologists disagree and claim that actually Jews are as close or as tied to Israel as they've ever been before, but expressing that differently. And since all of us choose data to reinforce the ideas that we already believe to be true about the world, both sets of sociologists have plenty of data at their disposal to support either side of that argument. I think a more accurate portrayal would be put this as simply as follows. 2 generations ago, the state of Israel was probably the strongest organizing force for the American Jewish community. It was what you might call centripetal. Today, there is no stronger disorganizing force in Jewish life, no single greater source of tension in Jewish communal politics than the state of Israel. In other words, the relationship of Jews to each other as reflected through the state of Israel is moving from being centripetal to being centrifugal. Again, that doesn't mean necessarily that Jews are less in relationship to the state of Israel than they were before, but rather than the state of Israel being an organizing force in Jewish life, the state of Israel increasingly has become a disorganizing force. And just as one metaphor to this effect, in the 1980s and 1990s, the Jewish community invested massive amounts of resources on the idea, cultivating the idea of Jewish pluralism. The urgency and importance of Jewish pluralism. How many of you remember that moment in American Jewish life? And so many institutions grew out of that urgency that Jews with different beliefs needed to find ways to talk to each other more effectively and build community across difference. And so we built Hillels, and we built community day schools, and we invested in fellowship programs that brought together Jews of different denominational backgrounds. And if you fast forward 30 years later, while many of those institutions did tremendous work for the Jewish community, it turns out we are very, very good as a Jewish people about being pluralistic about those things that we don't really care about. And we are as bad, if not worse, in terms of political pluralism today than we ever were 35 years ago when it came to denominational pluralism. So the State of Israel has moved from being an organizing force to a disorganizing force. And this is exacerbated by the fact that this is taking place out loud and in public. Any of you remember that idea that used to exist in the Jewish community? Some of you may recall this idea that we don't air our dirty laundry in public. You remember it? I say it that way because it simply doesn't exist anymore. It's like a quaint idea, a story that said something true about Jews in the 1950s, but simply doesn't characterize what Jews are today or what human beings are today. There's no such thing as a significant conversation that matters politically and socially and culturally that can only take place in the context of a community that lives far apart from each other and can't be conducted or transacted out loud in public. So this issue of the divide in the Jewish community is not merely that we are centrifugal as opposed to centripetal, and not just that this is taking place out there in public, but that it appears that there are no ground rules left. How do we talk about each other in public, the nature of criticism, ground rules that I think mattered at a certain point in Jewish history because of exigencies that were created by historical circumstances, but simply don't characterize the way that Jews behave or think about their collective identity together. And so this idea of a family emerged, born of circumstances that were almost external to the community itself. We had these ground rules created by political and historical circumstances that inclined us to believe we were a family and to not necessarily need to or feel the urgency to challenge that metaphor because it was actually useful. Those conditions were the urgency around the birth of the State of Israel, which translated very quickly for American Jews into a very clear notion of what it was they were supposed to do in that moment. What were the three things that American Jews had to do in that moment to help this nascent and possibly failed project get off the ground? Mostly send money, political lobbying, and advocacy. Three very clear agenda items that suggested right away the Jewish people are in need, and now it's our opportunity to step up, and here are the clear avenues by which we're going to be able to do this. The Holocaust, right in the rearview mirror of the Jewish people in that moment, had reminded many Jews that they were other, capital O, they were other to the rest of the world, and they always would remain other, and therefore it forced or catalyzed a relationship that Jews might have to the State of Israel to be stronger than it might have been before. And so clear roles, born out of clear historical moments, created this notion that the Jewish people were one entity, even if divided between two places, and that there were clear and transparent obligations that existed between one and the other, giving rise to this idea of the family. We're all part of the same people. We're simply playing out our parts of this story in different places given the realities of where we happen to live. Family told a story that made sense when there was an impetus to believe that we were all implicitly part of the same team. And now, of course, it's not always the case, but many of the people who emphasize the language of family do so precisely because they feel that other people are not doing right by the family. That's oftentimes the common way in which the family metaphor is deployed. Not the family metaphor that says, since we're family, we're always going to stay together. You're always welcome at my table. Regardless of what you do, you're always welcome in my institution. Actually, no. More often than not, the metaphor of family is used through an anxiety that reflects a kind of anger. I think we're family. Why are you not behaving like a member of the family ought to? Family allows us to say we and imply a they, to celebrate the relationship that we have with the State of Israel and to criticize the relationship that they have with the State of Israel as being insufficiently connected. And disagreement, and we see this all the time, gets translated all too quickly into disloyalty. Those are radically different things, and the family metaphor allows for a clean slippage between the two. I think there are 6 problems with the metaphor of family. That's the way of hedging my bets. You don't like the first 4, maybe you'll like number 5. Number 1, we all relate to our families differently. And so any speaker who talks about the Jewish people as a family has coded in their own DNA and their family history and their background a certain set of understandings of how families treat each other. But how am I supposed to map my expectations of you when your family story is radically different than my own? Number 2, these families, if we want to call them that, between America and Israel, are evolving dramatically. Or put differently, the Jewish people in 2016 is not the same people that it was in 1948. And that's not just because of the passage of time or the passage of generations. Increasingly, American Jews and Israeli Jews don't recognize each other as actually part of the same ethnic families, and with really good reason. The multiple aliyot transformed the ethnic character of the Jewish people in Israel such that today, Ashkenazim are not the majority in Israeli society, but Mizrahim, Middle Eastern Jews, represent a plurality, and Ashkenazim are still a majority of American Jews. So ethnically, we don't really recognize each other, but obviously the more significant factor to the changeover of Jewish family life in America have been the phenomena of intermarriage and conversion and the ways in which the boundaries of the family for American Jews have expanded so dramatically. And so to say we are family, when so many members of our family would say about those other people, I don't know who they are, implies that we're holding on to a metaphor that doesn't serve who the people are or they're actually becoming. Problem number 3, families drift over time. One of the things that I sometimes do in my teaching is I poll audiences who are, let's say, 60 and above, and I poll audiences of college students who we teach, and I ask them, how many of you have cousins in Israel? Older audiences that I speak to almost all raise their hands. Younger students don't. Now, is it because they don't have family in Israel? They probably do. But think about the different relationship that you have from your first cousins to your fourth cousins. So imagining that simply because there's some ancestral familial link between these two places, that's going to carry over indefinitely in time, is naive, and it's simply not how families work. A fourth problem, is family something that is taught, or is it only lived? Or put differently, the minute I start trying to teach you or convince you that you are a member of my family, I've probably lost the argument. Families are things that feel intrinsic, that we feel connected to simply on the basis of our upbringing. Who did we spend our holidays together, right? Who did we speak to on Friday afternoon before Shabbat? But if I have to start rationally educating you that somebody you've never met in a country far away with very little to do with your day-to-day life is actually a member of your family, I'm implying a pedagogy that might not be possible. The fifth I alluded to before, if this is a family, and this is the way in which we sometimes talk about family is saying, well, it's dysfunctional, but we're not playing by the rules of any family. And that, in that case, our behavior is indicating that we don't actually buy into the story of family anymore. But the sixth one, and I think this is probably the most important, even those of us who still insist that the Jewish people is a family who's divided, I don't think we really believe it. And to this I want to offer what I call the B'nai Brak test case. If you believe in some notion of the Jewish people as family, does that mean that you really believe that an ultra-Orthodox Jew in B'nai Brak who you never met and probably never will, with whom you have massive disagreements on how you live your life, religious values, political values, who may not even believe in the legitimacy of the State of Israel, do you believe that that person is higher on your hierarchy of loyalties than your neighbors here in Palo Alto with whom you share your lives? And my guess is that even when we say, yes, I want that person to be part of my family, I'm not sure we really believe it. It certainly doesn't play out in the way that we interact with our friends and loved ones, where we all know that we all have the families we grow up with and the families that we choose. And proximity and values are huge drivers in how we create our chosen families, as opposed to the families that we grow up with, where our distant, far off, mythical and metaphorical relatives have a harder and harder time making a claim over the sincerity of our convictions and our relationships. That's why oftentimes family is a coercive, even a tyrannical framework that we impose on a much more complicated story that serves certain individuals in how they imagine a relationship to Israel, and who oftentimes want to criticize the relationship to Israel of others who simply don't feel that same bond of family. I don't know where the history of this comes from, but David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of the state of Israel, is known for, in addition to his extraordinary leadership, making a couple of what turned out to be bad deals. That's part of what happens with innovative and visionary leadership. You have to do things in a moment, even if it winds up costing you generations down the line. The lesser-known bad deal that Ben-Gurion made in the late 1940s and early 1950s was with Jacob Blaustein of the American Jewish Committee. Immediately after the creation of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion said, great, the Jewish people have a state. The next big thing that has to happen is that all the world Jewry has to move to Israel to populate this state so we can win the demographic war. And a lot of Jewish communities all over the world picked up and left, with the exception, really, of one, this one. And why? Because Jacob Blaustein, the head of the American Jewish Committee, stood up to Ben-Gurion and said, no. On behalf of the American Jewish community, I say to you, David Ben-Gurion, you are responsible for your people, and I, the leader of the American Jewish community, am responsible for my people. And I wonder whether in that moment, and kind of amazingly, because he never backed down from anything, Ben-Gurion backed down. And why do you suppose he backed down? Because there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. The trade-off of stopping to antagonize American Jews about making Aliyah was the trade-off of philanthropy, advocacy, and lobbying. But in that moment, the Jewish people planted a seed which said, even if we felt like family in 1948, 2-3 generations down the line, the insistence that we are pursuing radically different stories will not be sustainable in being able to tell the story of family for generations to come. First cousins become third cousins. And a deal made by Ben-Gurion, which actually harkens back to a moment that took place in the book of Genesis, when Abraham says to his nephew Lot, better because we're family to go in different directions. Look how amazing the Bible is on that. It's not because we're family we shouldn't fight. He says we're going to fight, and the best way to preserve our family is to not live in the same place. Any of you have family members like that? And at the moment, it seems like a good family decision. Long term, it seems that we're reaping the consequences. We decided to pursue separate destinies. The insistence today that we are the same families does not comport to the realities that we live in, nor the values that we want to hold on to. So what if we're not? What if we're not family? What would be the other metaphors or mythical frameworks that we would use to understand and express what this relationship is all about? I'm going to suggest a couple. I don't have a ton of time up here, so this is part of your assignment going forward. Which of these works for you? Which of these tells your story a little bit more effectively? And perhaps the biggest idea, all of this, what would it look like to cultivate a community that could actually be pluralistic about the very metaphors that we use to describe the relationship to Israel? For you, it might be family. For me, as I'm going to talk about, maybe it's that we're simply the mutual descendants of a shared ancestor. It's really hard to do because once you've made this metaphor work, it seems that someone else's choice of a metaphor is doing violence to your choices. But could it be possible precisely in this moment of challenge, to come up with a menu of options of the metaphors that we want to use for this relationship with Israel, precisely to salvage a communal unity that seems so inaccessible. Let me suggest 4. One, not a lot of people are going to like, and it's called consumer. Maybe Israel and world Jewry are simply shared consumers of this product called Israel. People who really love Israel and think of themselves as what I like to call peoplehood people, you know what I'm talking about? Peoplehood people are not going to like the terminology of consumer because it sounds like you're not really so close to something. And after all, a consumer might be a really loyal consumer for a certain period of time until somebody else introduces another product. For instance, a product for which you could still keep your headphones connected. So I might be a consumer with profound loyalty up until the point that I'm not. But keep in mind that even in this terminology of consumer that people who feel connected to Israel aren't going to particularly like, our community throws out terminology that connotes consumerism as part of the relationship to Israel all the time, things like brand Israel and startup nation. We oftentimes try to sell Israel as part of Jewish education, which means we're already playing with a little bit of a consumer model to begin with. What about a model of investors or stakeholders? That the Jewish people in America are not members of the same family and not consumers of Israel, but they are investors or stakeholders. Now, an investor or a stakeholder doesn't leave quite as quickly as a consumer leaves, because you got skin in the game. You've made an investment, you've made a commitment that you hopefully have reaped value of over time, and if you haven't, you want to stay in longer to be able to get your investment out. You know, every time an Israeli tells me to stay out of the internal politics of Israel, I'm inclined to tell them to give me back our park benches. We American Jews have had profound investment in the state of Israel. And so even if right now it feels like it is a bunch of disgruntled investors, that doesn't forfeit the profound investment that American Jews have made over time. Maybe we are not consumers or investors, but partners, right? Beyond an investor, in which I can imagine a distinction between the person who's putting in the money and the person who's running it. A partner connotes that all of this advocacy and lobbying and philanthropy has actually made us equal players. A high degree of exit, really hard to extricate yourself from a real partnership. What do we gain out of that metaphor, or what do we lose? And the fourth, the one that I think I'm personally gravitating towards, which is going to sound the weakest, but I think we need to fortify the very weakest ones if we're going to actually make intact all of these possibilities for our community, is that we are mutual descendants of a shared ancestor. That our job is to foster a sense of mutuality between these two communities, even if, and Zach and I have debated this extensively, even if it feels very weak to simply call ourselves the mutual descendants of a shared ancestor, and even if it can dissipate quickly over time. Let me play out what that might mean, and then I'll hand over to our next session. What if we imagine that America and Israel are not American Jews and Israeli Jews are not members of the same family, except those who are actually in the same families, and not just consumers or investors or stakeholders, but two stories of the Jewish people who are still responding to the same set of questions. For about 300 years, the Jewish people has been invested in responding to two major problems: the problem of emancipation and the problem of enlightenment. Emancipation suggested to Jews that we were going to have to find a different way to ensure political citizenship, political vibrancy, and our own group survival. The State of Israel answers that set of questions with sovereignty, and American Jews have answered that set of questions by becoming the most powerful Jewish diasporic community to ever live in a diaspora country in our history. Both American Jews and Israelis have separately and differently been investing much of the last 60 years in solving the emancipation problem. What's going to be the best technology to make the Jewish people safe? In fact, much of what holds the Jewish people together between America and Israel has been working together on this emancipation issues in ways that served both communities. So Jews becoming powerful in Washington is good for American Jews and ultimately also good for the safety and survival of Israeli Jews as well. It's not that the emancipation problem has been solved. Anti-Semitism still exists in America and seems to be on the rise. Israel still faces existential threats, but we are doing better at solving the emancipation problem as separate societies than I think we ever have. Tfu, 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 knock on plastic, etc. The second problem is the one neither society has solved particularly well yet, and that is, what does it mean to be Jewish in an open marketplace and in a society where you have a lot of agency and autonomy? You don't have to solve that problem if you're worrying about being safe. In many ways, both the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community have chronically postponed the problem of what it means to be Jewish because there was bigger fish to fry, which was simply staying alive and having some sense of political autonomy and sovereignty. But here there's an opportunity. To be mutual descendants of the shared ancestor might be that Jews in America and Jews in Israel can both be radically experimenting with what it means to be Jewish in societies where we have power and agency and affluence, and where we might be able to learn from each other. One of the best examples to this effect is that Jewish pluralism, even though it is not on the rise in the Israeli political establishment, is on the rise in the Israeli public culture. There are many more expressions of Jewishness in a public square, creative expressions of Jewishness today than there have been ever before, and much of that, it's not talked about, much of that was learned from the American Jewish community. We invented Jewish pluralism, and our Israeli friends have learned from it. In the meantime, Israel is pioneering all sorts of ideas of what Jewishness looks like lived outside and in public. If you've not been to the Friday night service at the port in Tel Aviv, you're missing one of the most interesting phenomena in Jewish spirituality in 2,000 years. 1,500 people coming to pray outside in Tel Aviv in a creative alternative service that involves the hybrid of traditional modes and new modes, classical liturgy and new poetry. When I was there this summer, it was Jews and Christians and Muslims. And we American Jews, as we become more comfortable being Jews in public, starting to perform our rituals in public, things like Sukkah City, or other types of exhibits in which Jews are saying, I don't want to simply be a Jew inside an institution, I want to be a Jew in public. The state of Israel offers us templates where we might learn from those. We might be able to similarly create extraordinary Jewish ritual, not just inside Jewish institutions, as has classically been the legacy of the American Jewish community, but very much outside there and in public. Now, I know that when we talk about peoplehood and when we care about peoplehood, that language of family is a little bit more seductive than this notion of a shared ancestor. After all, the notion of family creates a stronger emotional tie over us than simply coming to terms with the fact that we're moving in different directions. But I want to be honest that the moment that we're living in Jewish life no longer correlates to the story that we insist on telling. When there's a gap between the story that you tell about yourselves and the empirical realities that you're in, you need to start correcting one or the other. And I'm not convinced that it will be particularly easy or effective to turn American Jews and Israeli Jews into family members. It might be much easier and certainly more effective to come up with a different mythical story that we choose to tell about ourselves that can actually correlate to the ongoing decisions that the Jewish people are making in these two places. Courageous leadership, the one that's going to be exhibited by this institution and the many institutions that you and us together run in the Jewish community, in struggling with this division between Jews in America and Jews in Israel, will be to formulate models that actually work. It will be in the work of trying to connect between Jews who are telling radically different stories about what belonging looks like, and not merely either lamenting the ones that have failed us that we're still sentimentally holding on to, or attacking those Jews whose relationship to Israel doesn't look like the ones that we tell about ourselves. It may mean that peoplehood won't hold us as tightly in the next century or as emotionally as it did for the 20th century. But it might well mean that we as the Jewish people have an opportunity to share a narrative that can serve the 21st century Jewish people as well as the old stories served the Jews of the 20th century. Thank you.